So we're going to talk about the best enemies that money can buy. And the title of the talk actually comes from this little book, which I did not own until Hal gave me a copy about 5 minutes ago. It's by Anthony Sutton. I have almost all the books he has written. He is, I believe, one of America's greatest historians of all time. Wrote lots of books, and I will reference him repeatedly throughout the talk today. But what we have here is a situation where the U.S. government has been creating and manufacturing enemies to fight against us, to steal our freedom, to steal our money for at least 100 years that we know of, and probably longer than that. I saw this meme not long ago, and it's just perfect, right? You got my tax dollars, somehow also my tax dollars. That's a picture of rockets flying from Gaza into Israel, which of course are paid for by our taxes, and then that's the Iron Dome knocking them out, which of course are also paid for by our taxes. For every $6 billion that the U.S. government sends to the Israeli government to defend itself, they send $21 billion to the Arab and Islamic governments that want to destroy Israel. So how does that make any sense at all? Of course it doesn't. It's ridiculous and it's unconstitutional, but it's very typical of what we find. Now, H.L. Mencken, I think, put it very well when he said that the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. I would take issue with that. Not all of them are necessarily imaginary. We do have some real enemies, the flesh, the world, the devil. We do have some real enemies, but a lot of the ones that the government has told us are enemies are actually bought and paid for by that same government. Here's another great meme, right? Here's how do we control internet speech? How would you like this wrapped? Asks the corporate media. Anti-terrorism or protect kids? Very typical. They've always got some kind of excuse why we need to take people's freedom, and typically it sounds nice at first glance, but then you realize it's just an excuse. Now, they've actually thought about this. This isn't just a haphazard idea. They've put a lot of thought and planning into this idea of creating enemies and using war and crises to steal our freedom. Back in 1962, the U.S. State Department commissioned a report. The title of the report kind of gave the whole agenda away. It was called "A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations." And the goal of the report was to figure out how do we get from where we're at, the kind of Westphalian world order where you have sovereign or at least relatively sovereign nation states, how do we get from that to a system of global governance, a world effectively controlled by the United Nations? They hired a guy called Lincoln Bloomfield to write the report. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was an intelligence operative and leader with the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and a high-ranking official for a long time with the State Department. And he concluded in the report that the fastest way to get a one-world government would be a grave crisis or a war to bring about a sudden transformation in national attitudes sufficient for the purpose. He said if we just allow organic trends to proceed, it would take more than 200 years to get a one-world government, and so we needed to accelerate this process, and war was the best way to do it. He said the best way to accelerate this would be a crisis, a war, or a brink of war situation so grave or commonly menacing that deeply rooted attitudes and practices are sufficiently shaken to open the possibility of a revolution in world political arrangements. And they weren't just like speculating about this. They had seen how effective it was, right? World War I, what happened after World War I? They tried to build the League of Nations. Now, the U.S. Senate very wisely declined to participate in that, so they had to go back to the drawing board. But they did get a lot of institutions of global governance at that time. We ended up with things like Interpol and the Bank for International Settlements in the years that followed. Then World War II came along. Even worse, even more destructive, even more dead people. What did we get? We got the United Abominations. We got the United Nations, sorry. We got the World Bank. We got the International Monetary, somebody caught that. Thank you, Rev. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and a lot of other terrible institutions that today we call the architecture of global governance. And this is not new, right? You go back almost 200 years. The great Frederick Bastiat, the French lawmaker and philosopher, explained that tyrants, totalitarians, are always concocting the antidote and the poison in the same laboratory. So you create the poison and then you pose as the savior. And we see this over and over and over again. The same people creating the real and imagined problems are also the same people who are allegedly going to save us from them. And there are so many examples. Now, back to Anthony Sutton again. I said we're going to rely a lot on his research in this particular talk. But he wrote a book called America's Secret Establishment. Some of you knew the great Charlotte Iserby. She lived not far from here. Actually, 1 year after Camp Constitution, I took my family. We went up to her house and stayed there for a few days. Wonderful lady. She was a senior advisor to Ronald Reagan on education, and then she found out they were trying to merge the American and the Soviet educational system, so she started leaking all the documents, and she didn't last very long at the Department of Education. But her dad was a member of a secret society called Skull and Bones. Her grandpa was also a member of a secret society called Skull and Bones. And when her dad passed away, she inherited all his stuff. So she got this weird Skull and Bones cuckoo clock, which I had the opportunity to see. She also got all of his documents and papers. And she said, wow, this is important. So she gave it to Anthony Sutton. And Anthony Sutton decided it was important enough to write a book about. It's called America's Secret Establishment, An Introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones. And what he says is, this secret society at Yale University is a recruiting ground for a global conspiracy for world government. And the reason we bring this up is because they use the same kind of strategy. But first, and I've showed this clip before in talks on the deep state, but I just want to show you guys a little bit about this group, Skull and Bones. Obviously, I don't endorse ABC fake news. They're liars and propagandists, but they did get some really good footage of what these weirdos do when they think people aren't looking.
And so when we heard that some enterprising characters had managed to spy on the famous Skull and Bones Society, well, we couldn't resist. Here's ABC's Dan Harris.
The videotape provides a grainy glimpse into what appear to be the initiation rituals of a secret society that's been around since 1832, whose members have gone on to be leaders of Wall Street and the White House, the Senate and the Supreme Court.
They're sort of trying to scare the initiates, make them, disorient them, frighten them.
New York Observer investigative reporter Ron Rosenbaum accompanied a team of Yale students who shot these pictures 9 days ago. Rosenbaum's curiosity about Skull and Bones was permanently piqued when, as a classmate of George W. Bush, he lived right next to the Tomb, the group's heavily fortified home. From their perch, Rosenbaum and his cohorts taped the Tomb's courtyard. What they captured, they say, was initiates, known as neophytes, being forced to kiss a skull, then members performing a mock killing. It may look like
Kind of weird. Mock killings. They do all kinds of weird stuff at their headquarters, the Tomb. And the reason I bring them up is because Anthony Sutton explains how they operate in his book. He says they use a dialectical process to bring about change, and that this process requires conflict. Conflict requires a clash of opposites. You can't just have a right or a left. You've got to have both a right and a left. And here's one obvious example of this. Right? You had two presidential candidates in the 2004 election, one allegedly of the right, one allegedly of the left, and they're both part of the same tiny weirdo secret society.
We were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society. It's so secret we can't talk about it. What does that mean for America? The conspiracy theorists are going to go on. Sure they are. I don't know. I haven't seen the web. Number 322. First of all, he's not the nominee, and look, I look for. Are you prepared to lose? No, I'm not going to lose. You both were members of Skull and Bones, a secret society at Yale. What does that tell us? Not much, because it's a secret.
Ooh, okay. And there are many more examples we could give you of this, right? Here's another member of Skull and Bones. You might have heard of him, William F. Buckley. Oh, yeah. The fake media told us he was the leader of the conservative movement. Washington Compost, New York Slimes, NPR. Anytime those guys tell you who is the leader of the conservative movement, you need to run in the other direction. And so he was a very good puppet for the right, so that he could try to control the narrative. And he did a very good job on this, right? He misled a whole generation of conservatives into thinking that huge government and abortion and the United Nations were conservative. Here's one of the many idiotic things he said. This was back in 1952. He said, "We have to accept big government for the duration. For neither an offensive nor a defensive war can be waged, given our present government skills, except through the instrument of a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores." So thanks, William Buckley. We'll fight communism by having communism. Yeah, that's a great idea. We'll fight totalitarian bureaucracy by having a totalitarian bureaucracy within our own shores. I mean, it's madness. It's ludicrous. It's ridiculous. And yet, for a whole generation of Americans who didn't yet realize the media was constantly lying to us, he was the leader of the conservative movement. He could decide who's part of the conservative movement and who's not. Now let's go to this issue of the Cold War. Again, we go to Anthony Sutton, historian at Stanford University, great American. He found out that the very people who financed the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia were the same deep state mega bankers that were trying to enslave us here at home. And he got the proof. He had the corporate documents. He had the State Department records. It was absolutely incredible. And he's got them all in his book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. He actually shows that Leon Trotsky, one of the revolutionaries, was given millions of dollars by these mega bankers. Same thing with Vladimir Lenin. Now, why would capitalists, allegedly, want to finance a communist revolution? We'll come back to that. But communism is not what we've been told. It's not an economic ideology. It's not a movement of the oppressed for liberation. It's actually a gigantic scam. It's a fake ideology invented by a cabal of megalomaniacs to enslave humanity. And it was very helpful for them to enslave that great empire of Russia for the purpose of doing a whole lot of terrible things. Now, it was bad enough that they helped the communists take over Russia with huge amounts of money, diplomatic support, etc. After they put this terrorist regime in power, they did everything possible to build it up and make it stronger, which sounds totally crazy because it is crazy. But again, it's very well documented. Anthony Sutton, again, did a great book called Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. What he showed was that virtually all of the economic development in the Soviet Union was bought and paid for by us, by Americans, whether through taxpayer funding or through our big corporations giving them everything that they needed. A lot of this was done out in the open. Some of you probably have heard of the Lend-Lease program. Some of you probably remember the propaganda from World War II. Joseph Stalin, he's Uncle Joe. He's a good friend of ours. We need to build factories for him so he can build airplanes and tanks and bombs and guns and missiles and bullets. Allegedly, that was to help stop the Nazis. We'll come back to the Nazis in a moment. Same story once again. But the U.S. government built up the Soviet war machine. The U.S. government built up the Soviet economy. The U.S. government gave them virtually everything that they needed and then some. There's another great book. This was part of the John Birch Society's, what were they called? The 12 Candles, I think it was. And it's really powerful. It's written by Major Jordan. He was an Air Force military officer. And he was actually in Montana, and what he was doing was participating with this Lend-Lease program, and he saw unbelievable amounts of very sensitive weapon systems, everything you can imagine, tobacco, food, everything that the Soviets would need. And then he found out they were even sending the things that they needed to make nuclear weapons. They were literally sending them the tools that they needed to make nuclear weapons. Why would subversives within the U.S. government want a terrorist regime, a mass murdering regime that slaughtered millions and millions of its own people? Why would we want them to have nuclear weapons? And of course, any sane person would not want them to have nuclear weapons, and yet our government deliberately facilitated this. And this kind of idiocy continues to this day. Some of you have probably heard of Vladimir Putin, the dictator of Russia. He's an interesting guy. Now, before becoming the allegedly conservative Christian leader of Russia, which, by the way, is all smokescreen, he was a senior officer with the KGB for many years, one of the most ruthless entities that's ever existed on the planet. He ended up actually the head of the KGB, the renamed KGB. And, of course, he was working very closely with the same Western globalists that we deal with on a daily basis. World Economic Forum, how many have heard of the World Economic Forum? Okay, good. So here is the head of the World Economic Forum admitting that Vladimir Putin was a young global leader of the World Economic Forum.
This notion to integrate young leaders is part of the World Economic Forum since many years. And I have to say, when I mention now names like Mrs. Merkel, even Vladimir Putin and so on, they all have been young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. Mm-hmm. But what we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina, and so on.
So, lots and lots of bigwigs are part of this cabal. Now, Henry Kissinger is another really interesting example. You guys know Henry Kissinger. He went to go meet his maker a few years ago, and I can't imagine that went very well. But really. But he was very close to Putin for a very long time. He actually writes, they write about each other in their autobiographies. Every time Kissinger would go to Moscow, they'd have a big parade for him. They would give him awards, and they'd do all kinds of fun stuff. He would go have private dinners with Putin. Then Putin would come to New York. He'd go over to Henry Kissinger's house. They'd have private dinners and big festivities. Putin actually describes him in his book as a close personal friend in his own autobiography. Very interesting. And of course, Henry Kissinger was a poodle for the Rockefellers. Right? That's where he got his big start. And he actually recruited Klaus Schwab. So you got the chain of command there. Klaus Schwab recruited by Henry Kissinger recruited by the Rockefeller clan recruited by Satan, and so you see the chain of command there. No, but really, it's unbelievable, all these connections. They're right there. You don't have to go into the smoky rooms. It's all out in the open. It's all very public. Putin has been connected with these people for decades, and he's actually following their plan to a T. Right? Henry Kissinger, in his book World Order, outlined the process for getting to world order. This was published in 2014. He said the way we're going to do it is we're going to divide the world up into regional orders, with the European Union being the premier example, and then we're going to merge all of these regional orders into a one world order. That's what he describes in his book. And that's, of course, exactly what Vladimir Putin is doing. He's building what he calls the Eurasian Union, imposing this transnational regime on a lot of the former Soviet space, and also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS, which are intended to be like rivals to the degenerate Western Bloc, NATO and friends, right? So very, very strange. And of course, the U.S. government is still sending Putin all kinds of money, right? It's in the news, right? They're making more on oil money now from the United States than they were before the war started. And yet we're supposedly about to go to war with them. Right? And I don't rule out the possibility of a war. These maniacs may well try to start World War III. They may well use nuclear missiles. But we need to understand that we're being deceived here on a massive level. Now, going back to the Nazis, because that was the excuse why we built up Stalin and the Soviet war machine in the first place. Uncle Joe needed our help to fight Nazis. Well, it turns out the same cast of criminals also helped bring Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists to power. Again, we go to Anthony Sutton. He's got another book called Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. It's a fascinating book. I'd recommend you get a copy for your library. In fact, everything Anthony Sutton ever wrote is brilliant. You should get copies of all of them for your library. But what he documents with U.S. government documents, State Department records, corporate records, is that some of our biggest banks and corporations, with full support of people in the government, were building up the Nazi movement, funding the Nazi war machine, even some of the most disgusting aspects of Nazism, which there are many, like the eugenics. Those ideas were coming from here. The money for that madness was coming from here. The Rockefeller dynasty was some of the biggest financiers of the eugenics movement anywhere. They were actually the biggest financiers of Dr. Mengele, the sicko that was doing weird experiments on children in the Nazi concentration camps. And of course, a lot of that was happening in the United States too. Sterilization, things like that, although it kind of got a bad smell with the Nazis, so they pretended like, oh, we don't like that anymore. Now they've got an Indian running the Rockefeller Foundation, like, oh, see, we don't believe in eugenics anymore. Yeah, right. So, Wall Street financed these megalomaniacs. They helped them prepare for war. Rockefellers were a huge part of this. Standard Oil had, of course, already officially been broken up by the U.S. government, but the remnants of Standard Oil, almost wholly controlled by the Rockefeller dynasty, gave Hitler the technology he needed to make his war machine possible. They gave him the chemicals, the formulas, and even the ability to make factories so they could produce jet fuel for the Luftwaffe that, of course, would go on to kill huge numbers of Europeans and Americans. And one of the biggest financiers of all of this was somebody that we should hopefully recognize. The dad of George H.W. Bush, the grandpa of George W. Bush, Senator Prescott Bush. He was a director and a major shareholder with Union Bank of New York. They actually had their assets seized in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act. Why? Because they were financing the Nazi war machine. They were profiting from the Nazi war machine. They were sending Hitler and his war machine money and his companies. Same thing, IG Farben, one of the big Nazi companies that was producing the chemicals that they needed. They went into a joint venture with what was left of Standard Oil. Over and over and over again, you have prominent Americans, the same cast of characters or their descendants that today are working to enslave us, working to build up the Nazi war machine. Now, some of this has come out in the press. Right? 20 years ago, The Guardian, which is a left-wing newspaper, had an article on how Bush's grandfather helped Hitler rise to power. Here's what they said in the article, based on declassified documents, which, of course, Anthony Sutton exposed this stuff way before these documents were declassified. We didn't need this. But they said even after America had entered the war, and then when there was already significant information about the Nazis' plans and policies, Prescott Bush worked for and profited from companies closely involved with the very German businesses that financed Hitler's rise to power. It's been suggested that the money he made from these dealings helped establish the Bush family fortune and set up its political dynasty. Interesting. Same thing with Klaus Schwab, by the way. He was overseeing a slave labor camp using slave labor for the Nazi war machine. His son, Klaus Schwab, recruited by Henry Kissinger at Harvard University, went on to finance the World Economic Forum, which they're now using to bring all the businesses of the world into this one world order. And I'll talk about that later today when we get to the climate change hoax. I think I'm talking on the climate change hoax. I know we have Dr. Willie soon, who's way more qualified on the science, but I'd like to show some of that if that's on the schedule for today. Now, I mentioned World War II, how this gave birth to basically all the institutions of global governance. But I want to go to China, because today, probably the most significant geopolitical threat to the United States and to liberty around the world is the Chinese Communist Party. It is a ruthless organization. It has slaughtered more people than any other organization in all of recorded human history. We've got about 100 million dead people directly attributable to the CCP, not including the unborn babies that they continue to slaughter in forced abortions and other things. Well, how did they come to power? At this point, you're probably not surprised. It's the very same cast of criminals. And the globalists made clear early on that they did not like Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was the liberty-minded Christian leader of the Free Chinese. He fought side by side with Americans during World War II against the Japanese. In fact, my grandpa was over there fighting the Japanese, so he would have fought alongside Chiang Kai-shek and his men. And yet early on, as far back as 1928, the Council on Foreign Relations, an organization formed to get Americans involved in all the globalism, was agitating against him and painting him as some sort of fascist, some sort of dictator, some sort of terrible guy. And we had communist agents all up and down the U.S. government who were helping in this effort. And of course, all the big media too. Right? They were painting the communists as agrarian reformers. Oh, they're just such nice guys. They just want a little bit of land redistribution and whatnot. Now, the plan was known to high-level officials in our government long before they were carried out. So 1935, right, before World War II even broke out, U.S. Ambassador to Moscow, William Bullitt, wrote to U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and he talked about the communist plans, what they wanted to do with Japan and how that would benefit this goal of expanding the slave empire of the Soviet Union. He wrote in this memo, "It's the heartiest hope of the Soviet government that the United States will become involved in war with Japan. To think of the Soviet Union as a possible ally of the United States in case of a war with Japan is to allow the wish to be father to the thought. The Soviet Union would certainly attempt to avoid becoming an ally until Japan had been thoroughly defeated and would then merely use the opportunity to acquire Manchuria and Sovietize China." Well, either he had a crystal ball, or he was a prophet, or he knew something really important, because that is exactly what happened just a few years later. Exactly what happened, to a T. The U.S. got involved in a war with Japan. The U.S. government knew very well at the highest levels that Pearl Harbor was going to happen. They were deliberately provoking the Japanese, and then we got in a war with them. And the U.S. government said, hey, maybe the Soviets will help us. Quick, send them lots of ships full of weapons and material and tanks and all kinds of fun stuff. So Stalin said, okay, well, I guess I'll join. After we dropped a nuclear bomb on Japan. Exactly what our ambassador told us was going to happen. They wouldn't want to become involved in the war until it was very obvious, until the Japanese were on their knees begging to surrender. And then, oh yeah, we'll declare war on Japan too. And because they were declaring war on Japan, they were then able to take control of Manchuria, which was occupied by the Japanese. It was filled with supplies that the Japanese had put there, weapons, food, uniforms, bullets, ammo, everything you could need. And they said, oh, this is great. We'll pass this on to Chairman Mao and his agrarian reformer buddies. Okay. And it got worse, and a lot of people at the high levels of our government knew this was going on. General Patrick Hurley, U.S. Ambassador to China at the end of World War II, said American diplomats surrendered the territorial integrity and the political independence of China and wrote the blueprint for the communist conquest of China in secret agreement at Yalta. Why would they want to do that? Right. Here's the picture of these people at Yalta. You see FDR right there. You see Uncle Joe, Joseph Stalin, one of the worst savages to ever walk on this planet. And then you see right behind him, Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was an important guy. He served at a very high level in the State Department. He ended up going on to help create the United Nations. He was the chairman of the conference that wrote the UN Charter. He was the first Secretary General of the UN. Then we threw him in prison because we found out he was a spy for Joseph Stalin. So these are the people who deliberately betrayed China into communism, and that's why they continue to live under this brutal tyranny to this day. They actually were very deliberate and open about this. George Marshall, also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, he was a senior military leader. He served as Secretary of State for a time. He boasted publicly of disarming Chiang Kai-shek and his men with the stroke of a pen. He thought that was great. Chiang Kai-shek and his men, of course, were trying to defend China, first from the Japanese, then from the communists. And with an arms embargo from the U.S. government, that was kind of difficult to do. Meanwhile, the communist Chinese had all the support they could ever want from their buddy in the Soviet Union. JFK talked about this on the floor of Congress. He said the responsibility for the failure, we should put in air quotes, of our foreign policy in the Far East rests squarely with the White House and the Department of State. The continued insistence that aid would not be forthcoming unless a coalition government with the Chinese communists were formed was a crippling blow to the nationalist government, to the national government. That was Chiang Kai-shek. Why would top-level U.S. government officials demand that the Free Chinese enter into a coalition with ruthless barbarians determined to enslave that nation? Terrible, terrible thing. JFK went on to say that what our young men had saved, our diplomats and our president have frittered away. And this evil continues to this day, right? It wasn't enough that we just helped put the barbarians in power. Then we built them up, just like we did with the Soviet Union, to the point now where communist China has, depending on whose numbers you look at, an economy almost the size of America's, maybe even bigger, depending on how you look at the numbers. They also have a lot of productive capability that they have had extracted from the United States. We'll talk about how the climate change process has facilitated that, shutting down industry in the United States, causing energy prices to skyrocket. That is directly causing our jobs, our production, our factories to be shipped to China. And we've had deliberate treason at the highest levels too. President Bill Clinton was actually caught. Right? They found out that Johnny Chung was funneling illegal CCP campaign contributions into the DNC in exchange for access. He was arrested. This came out in the news. He was charged. In exchange for all that illegal CCP money, President Clinton was giving them access to our highest level military technology. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff lambasted Clinton for this. He said President Clinton promised to restrain those who ordered the Tiananmen Square massacre, but he has now allowed these men whose hands are stained with the blood of martyrs of freedom into the highest reaches of our military defenses and made available to them significant portions of our advanced technology. That's treason. And then suddenly Monica Lewinsky pops out of the blue and, oh, we forgot all about the treason. Oh, no, perjury. Yeah, I mean, perjury is a crime. He should have gotten in big trouble. But I'd say treason is a little bit more important than perjury and other abuses. Now, this kind of stuff has gotten to the point where they've been very open about it. You guys recognize George Soros. He's put more money into our political process over the last few elections than almost anybody in all of history. And here he is talking about who should own the New World Order.
I think you need a new world order that China has to be part of the process of creating it, and they have to buy in. They have to own it the same way as, let's say, the United States owns the Washington Consensus, the current order.
How many think it's a good idea for the most murderous regime in all human history to own the New World Order? Yeah. Sounds like a really bad idea to me. Okay, really bad idea. I mean, it's bad enough that they've enslaved 1.5 billion people and murdered 100 million. If they murdered 100 million of their own people, what in the world do you think they'll do to you? Okay, it won't be fun. So here's Klaus Schwab again. Klaus Schwab has been one of the instrumental players in turning communist China into the powerhouse that it is today. They brag, the World Economic Forum brags that they've been working with the CCP for 40 years to have this accomplished in China. Here he is on communist Chinese television talking about what a great role model communist China is.
I respect China's achievements, which are tremendous over the last over 40 years since the opening up and policy and reform policy came into action. I think it's a role model for many countries.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a psychopath and you think mass murder and torture and censorship and concentration camps are great, I mean, that's a great role model right there. They're very efficient at imposing their totalitarian rule on their victims. Now, this has been going on, like I said, for a very long time. David Rockefeller, the guy who recruited Henry Kissinger, who recruited Klaus Schwab, he went over to Communist China in the early 1970s in his capacity as the leader of a major Wall Street bank, also the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he wrote publicly in the New York Slimes. The date is August 10th, 1973. It's still in their archives. That's a screenshot I pulled right from their website. An op-ed called From a China Traveler. You should read the whole thing. It is bonkers. Like, oh, such efficiency of administration, such dedication of purpose. What a great system they have. And he concludes by saying that the social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in human history. And again, he probably thinks that. If your perspective is that mass murder, slavery, genocide, extermination of whole people groups is good, then Communist China is definitely one of the most important and successful social experiments in all of human history. If you value liberty, prosperity, sanity, basic human rights, it's one of the most wicked and monstrous social experiments that we've ever seen in all of human history. Now, North Korea, same thing, right? Not a lot of people know this, but North Korea has been one of the largest recipients of U.S. foreign aid of any government in the world, and we give away a lot of foreign aid. To be one of the top recipients of foreign aid from the U.S. government is really quite an achievement. According to the Heritage Foundation, in 2002, they were actually the fourth largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid after Israel, Egypt, and Colombia. Amazing. Amazing. Now, the U.S. has actually been building factories over there for them to make weapons to point at us. Through the UN Development Program, they built a factory in Pyongyang, that's their capital, called the Pyongyang Semiconductor Factory. And of course, they're making microchips and semiconductors that they're using to put in missiles that they're pointing at us. And at the Japanese, and at the South Koreans. And really? We had to make a factory for them so they could build missiles to point at us, and then we had to send them food so they could divert more of the little bit of resources they have into making more missiles to point at us. We had to send them energy so that they could divert more of their energy into oppressing their people and building more missiles to point at us. But of course, North Korea is a very convenient pretext for expanding the power and authority of the United Nations. Wow, look at that crazy guy. He's got all these missiles. Yeah, made in USA, right? Paid for by U.S. taxpayers. But look at that crazy guy. He's got all these missiles. Just imagine if they landed on us or on our allies. Quick, give us more money. Give up more of your freedom. Okay? Now, they actually helped bring this mass murdering dictatorship to power there. I often wonder if this isn't like a weird social experiment. Like, how far can we push people before they finally break? I mean, it is the most bizarre regime in the world. It is certainly the most oppressive regime in the world. And yet General Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of allegedly fighting the commies in North Korea, writes in his book, Reminiscences, "I was forbidden hot pursuit of enemy planes that attacked our own. Manchuria and Siberia were sanctuaries of inviolate protection for all enemy forces and for all enemy purposes, no matter what depredations or assaults might come from there." Who was calling the shots, and why did they want to protect this dictatorship? Why wouldn't they let our military men go in there and wipe out the energy, the ammo, the depots? He goes on to say, "Then I was denied the right to bomb the hydroelectric plants along the Yalu. The order was broadened to include every plant in North Korea which was capable of furnishing electric power to Manchuria and Siberia. Most incomprehensible of all was the refusal to let me bomb the important supply center at Rasin, which was not in Manchuria or Siberia, but many miles from the border in northeast Korea. Rasin was a depot to which the Soviet Union forwarded supplies from Vladivostok for the North Korean army." By the way, we saw exactly the same thing in Vietnam later. Some of you might actually remember that from firsthand experience. So MacArthur actually quoted a communist Chinese general in his book, Lin Biao, who said there were leaflets, said, "I would never have made the attack and risked my men and military reputation if I had not been assured that Washington would restrain General MacArthur from taking adequate retaliatory measures against my lines of supply and communication." Somebody high up in the hierarchy wanted that crazy family to treat North Korea like an ant farm. And again, they're very convenient today. Now today we have the clowns at the... Oh, I thought I had an hour. I got 5 minutes left? Oh, okay. Well, thanks for letting me know, Hal. Good to know. All right, well, we're going to skip a lot of this. Today, the Council on Foreign Relations is saying we need to help the North Koreans more. We need to give them a sense of security. We need to give them, we need to acknowledge their right to a space program. Same exact thing happened in Cuba. We put Fidel Castro in power. Our own ambassador warned the State Department that Castro was a communist. The New York Slime said, oh, he's an anti-communist freedom fighter. He's like the George Washington of Cuba. He's just great. He's amazing. Okay? And yet our ambassador wrote a whole book about how the U.S. government deliberately brought him to power. They deliberately betrayed our ally, Fulgencio Batista. They put an arms embargo on him so that Cuba would fall to the commies. David Rockefeller, now burning in hell, with his buddy Fidel Castro, almost certainly also burning in hell. I hope they repented, but I don't think they did. And David Rockefeller wrote in his autobiography, some even believe we're part of a secret cabal, conspiring against the United States with other internationalists, with a secret cabal of other internationalists, trying to build a more integrated global political and economic structure, one world order, if you will. He says, if that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it. It's on page 405. There's a scanned copy. And, of course, they did the same thing, like I said, in Vietnam. They did the same thing all over southern Africa. They were funding the U.S. government, even under Reagan, was funding every communist terrorist group that they could find. Here's our top government officials with Saddam Hussein. He was our ally. We gave him all kinds of weapons. Same thing with the Iranians. Right? Here's Iraq. Declassified U.S. documents show support for Saddam Hussein. Biden is funding both sides of the Israel-Hamas war. War on drugs, same thing. Right? They've been caught repeatedly facilitating this thing. The war on drugs is a total fraud. Now, I'm not recommending anybody take drugs. Please don't do that. But the government itself is running the drugs. Here's the head of the DEA. He caught the CIA importing a metric ton of cocaine into this country with help from the Venezuelans. Listen.
The government itself may have been running drugs. The head of the DEA at the time, Robert Bonner, said that a ton of pure cocaine worth hundreds of millions of dollars had been smuggled into the United States. And he blamed the CIA, saying the agency had joined the Venezuelan National Guard in drug smuggling.
Now, we understand what you're saying. A ton of cocaine was smuggled into the United States of America by the Venezuelan National Guard?
Well,
in cooperation with the CIA?
that's exactly what appears to have happened.
Over and over and over again, they have been caught running the drugs that they then pump into our communities to get our kids addicted. And, of course, they use the money that they make to overthrow governments, fund terrorist movements, fund revolutions, etc. Same thing with the gun running, right? They actually got caught, again, Operation Gun Runner. They got caught sending heavy American weaponry to Mexican drug cartels. Then they said, oh, when they got caught, we were doing an investigation. We were trying to see where the guns would go. Turns out the guy they were investigating was already on the FBI payroll. It's all a fraud, folks. And by the way, before they got caught, they were saying, look at all the Mexicans killing each other with American guns. We need to attack the Second Amendment. Right? Same thing with Osama bin Laden and the Islamic terrorism. Here's the Wicked Witch of the West.
We also have a history of kind of moving in and out of Pakistan. I mean, let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago.
Yep.
And it was President Reagan in partnership with the Congress, led by Democrats, who said, you know what, sounds like a pretty good idea. Let's deal with the ISI and the Pakistani military, and let's go recruit these mujahideen, and let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam. So,
yeah, what could go wrong? Oops. CIA rebels fighting alongside Al-Qaeda. Here's Vice President Biden admitting that we were giving weapons to ISIS. Whoops, how did that happen, right? Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, NATO ally. Turns out the U.S. government knew they were Al-Qaeda since 2007. Former allies, we turned against them, right? Bashar al-Assad and Muammar Gaddafi. They were enemies, then they were allies. They were helping us torture jihadists. Then we didn't like them anymore. Now we're friends with the jihadists, funding the effort to overthrow their governments. Even ISIS, right? I've got this document from the Defense Intelligence Agency. It's a 2012 document where the Defense Intelligence Agency, our military intelligence agency, admitted, these are direct quotes, the West, the Gulf countries, and Turkey support the Syrian opposition. They also said that the Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. So we support it, and it's run by Al-Qaeda. Okay, they admit in the document. And then they say there's a possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria. And this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want in order to isolate the Syrian regime. And of course, they got it. Here it is, the Islamic State, ISIS, in eastern Syria, exactly what that document called for, exactly what they said they wanted. And Donald Trump actually pointed this out.
Government isn't giving us good protection. Our government has unleashed ISIS. I call President Obama and Hillary Clinton the founders of ISIS. They're the founders. In fact...
And the media was like, he can't say that. He's crazy. What a ridiculous conspiracy theory. And then he tweeted out that document that I just mentioned from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and total silence. Not another word. So I think we're out of time. I may pick back up here in my next talk because there's still more I wanted to share with you guys and kind of a wrap-up conclusion. But I think we have lunch now. Is that right, Hal? All righty. Well, thank you guys very much, and God bless you. Due to unforeseen circumstances, I didn't realize I had 45 minutes. I thought I had an hour before, so my presentation was longer than the time I had to give it. And I only found out 5 minutes before my time was up. So what we're going to do now, if that's all right with you guys, we're going to wrap up the talk on the best enemies money can buy. And we'll do that very quickly, and then we'll get into what everybody came to listen to, which is central bank digital currencies. So we were talking about ISIS, and I showed you guys the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency report admitting that the U.S. government and its allies were supporting the Syrian revolution. They admitted in the document they knew the Syrian revolution was led by Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood. And then they said, one of our goals is to create a Salafist principality in eastern Syria. Salafism is this kind of radical, hardcore Islam that they practice in some of the Arabian states. And of course, that's exactly what they got in the form of ISIS. And that is exactly what they wanted. So here's Trump one more time. Refresher.
Government isn't giving us good protection. Our government has unleashed ISIS. I call President Obama and Hillary Clinton the founders of ISIS. They're the founders. In fact, I think we'll give Hillary Clinton...
That's the kind of thing that would cause deep state people to want to shoot him, right? But he was exactly right. And when the media got all mad at him, he just tweeted out that document, and then everybody was completely silent. We didn't hear about it anymore. Thank you, sweetie. And so this is par for the course. Thank you. This is normal, standard operating procedure for the so-called intelligence agencies and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Do you have a question?
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
Explain very shortly what you mean by deep state?
Deep state. Oh man, thank you for asking that question. I've given several talks on that here, but my guess is you weren't here for them, and I wrote a book about it, so I shouldn't have assumed that everybody would know what I meant. So deep state at a superficial level, we're talking about the entrenched bureaucracy that is impossible to get rid of. But I think that is useful for analysis, and Donald Trump has talked a lot about the deep state in this context. When I talk about the deep state, I'm going one step further. Who is really pulling the strings of the entrenched bureaucracy? And I've identified a number of organizations that I consider to be a critical part of this network. The Council on Foreign Relations is one. I showed you guys earlier the Skull and Bones Secret Society is one. The Bilderberg Group, which I've snuck into before, is another one. You've got the Trilateral Commission founded by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. You have the Bohemian Grove weirdos out in Northern California. So a mixture of secret organizations and semi-secret or secretive organizations that all have as a official goal the creation of a one world system that would almost necessarily involve dramatic restrictions on individual liberty. So that's what I mean. Thank you for that question. Excellent. So the FBI has been doing this kind of thing for a very long time. In fact, this was actually my first thought when somebody took a shot at Trump. I thought, oh, they probably got the patsy. That was supposed to be the guy who was going to take the fall for shooting Donald Trump. But what they do, and they've been doing this for a long time, it's come out in all kinds of documents. Human Rights Watch did a good study. They go and find vulnerable people. They find people who have mental issues. They find potheads, and they say, hey, you hate Donald Trump? I hate Donald Trump too. Got lots of money. Hey, you and I, we could do something cool. We could, take him out. We'd be heroes. or they find some crazy guy who's attached to Islamism or whatever. They say, hey, you hate America? I hate America too. I got lots of money. We can make a bomb together and we'll blow stuff up, and all you got to do is push the button and you'll be a hero. And this guy goes, oh, really? Okay, great, money. And I just push a button, and then the FBI comes in, and wow, what heroic efforts here by the FBI. So this is what they do. It's what they've been doing for a long time. And Human Rights Watch actually did a comprehensive study on this, and they concluded that virtually every high-profile domestic terror case in the United States since September 11th featured the direct involvement of government agents. You probably remember what happened in Michigan, the fake kidnapping plot of Governor Whitmer. Most of the people involved in that operation were either working for the FBI or were confidential informants for the FBI, hoping to get out of criminal charges. And that's why the jury let most of them go. They said this was an FBI operation from start to finish. But it makes for good headlines. So they've been doing this for a long time. Operation Northwoods, this was a Department of Defense operation. They were going to, in their words, bomb my hometown of Miami. They were talking about sinking a ship full of refugees. They were talking about shooting down an airliner and blaming a foreign government as a pretext to start a war. John F. Kennedy did not allow them to do that, and that may be one of the reasons they came after him. CIA had similar plans. If you can read the Operation Mongoose declassified documents, again, same thing. They were going to create a fake terror campaign where they were going to put bombs in my hometown, bombs in Washington, D.C. They were going to kill people or kill fake people and then use that as a pretext to start a war. Now, we're going through all this list of enemies, so-called, that have been literally manufactured by the deep state, by the U.S. government, by subversive elements, at least within the U.S. government. And there's an even more recent example. You guys remember the invisible enemy? The freedom-stripping COVID-1984 virus?
People that we're doing everything we can each day to confront and ultimately defeat this horrible, invisible enemy. We're at war. In a true sense, we're at war. And we're fighting an invisible enemy. Think of that.
Yeah, so we've got visible enemies that we're building up, and we also, it turns out, have invisible enemies. And now a lot of this has come out in public, right? The NIH documents prove that the U.S. government itself was funding gain-of-function research in Wuhan. How many people are surprised, right? I mean, unbelievable, right? Here it is again, fake news. Here's the testimony in Congress, the deputy director of the NIH, admitting that they were funding gain-of-function research in Wuhan.
Tabak, did NIH fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology through EcoHealth?
It depends on your definition of gain-of-function research.
Sounds like Bill Clinton.
About the generic term, yes, we did.
Yeah, okay. It depends on what your definition of is, but yeah, we were kind of funding gain-of-function research at the Wuhan laboratory. Amazing. Right? Another enemy, once again, traced back to the criminal cartel, the cabal of megalomaniacs in Washington, D.C. HHS has now suspended funding for the Wuhan lab. Thank you. We see the same thing in the business world, right? And again, somebody asked me after the talk, why would they do this? Why are they doing this? They had missed the introduction where we talked about how war is such an excellent way to accelerate the process of globalism, stealing people's freedom, undermining national sovereignty, etc. But they had a big goal. According to Carol Quigley, a significant historian at Georgetown University, who was a mentor to Bill Clinton, he actually saw himself as part of the deep state. He bragged that he was very close to them for a period of decades. He said his chief difference of opinion was that they wanted to be secret and he thought they ought to be known. So he did this great book, A Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. And he said the powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching aim, nothing less than a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. He said the system would be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert in secret meetings and conferences. That's the deep state right there, the secret meetings and conferences. Maybe next year, if Hal wants me back, I'll come and give another talk on the deep state. He said the apex would be the Bank for International Settlements. And we'll come back to this when we talk about CBDCs in a moment. But here is one of the critical things to understand. Right? This also comes from that same book. The argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals and policies, one perhaps of the right and another of the left, is a foolish idea, acceptable only to doctrinaire and academic thinkers. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical, so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extensive shifts in policy. And that should sound familiar. We've been doing this for generations now. On the subject of the deep state, one of the other organizations that I often point to is the Council on Foreign Relations. It's a very powerful group set up in New York City. Actually, Carol Quigley revealed that it's part of an international operation called the Roundtable Groups, set up with money from Cecil Rhodes, the South African mining magnate who was funded by the Rothschild dynasty. And the purpose of this network was to build a one-world system. And the purpose of the U.S. branch of this, the Council on Foreign Relations, was to bring the United States into the system. And just to give you an illustration of the power of these people, here's again the Wicked Witch of the West giving a talk at the Council on Foreign Relations. This is in D.C. while she's serving as Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Richard, and I am delighted to be here in these new headquarters. I have been often to, I guess, the mothership in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this will mean I won't have this far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future. I mean, Rick.
All right, so who tells her what she should be doing and how she should be thinking about the future? Well, by her own admission, it's the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, lest you think I'm picking on demon rats, here is your least favorite Republic rat. His name is Dick Cheney. I call him Darth Vader.
Good to be back at the Council on Foreign Relations. As Pete mentioned, I've been a member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. I never mentioned that when I was campaigning for re-election back home in Wyoming.
No, you never mention that when you're campaigning for re-election. You don't want the suckers to know, right? Now, and I can show you a lot of these videos, but just in the interest of time, you remember Joe Biden? He was giving us some questions and answers from the media some time ago. He said, well, I can't answer any more questions. They're going to be mad at me. Who's going to be mad at you, man? Like, you're the president of the United States. Like, is your mom going to be mad? Like, who's going to be mad at you? So we all wonder, like, who's going to be mad? Who's this guy working for, right? And I think a lot of us assumed Satan, but he actually will give you a real strong clue about who he's working for right here. He's sitting next to Richard Haas, who at the time was the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Listen to this little dialogue.
The subject, though, today is another article in the magazine. I probably should introduce myself to people, everybody. My name is Richard Haas, by the way. I work here at the Council on Foreign Relations.
And I work for Richard.
And I work for Richard. Okay. So there you go. Continuing Carol Quigley's book, he says there does exist, and there has existed for a generation, an international Anglophile network that operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the communists act. In fact, he says, this network, which we may identify as the Roundtable Groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other groups, and frequently does so. And we see this in our own country, right? You guys remember Black Lives Matter? These guys are admitted Marxists. That's not my opinion. Here's one of the three co-founders, Patrisse Cullors, admitting on TV she's a trained Marxist.
I think that it might... I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists.
Trained Marxists. Wow. The revolution will be sponsored by American Airlines, Bank of America, Citibank, American Express. Right? You all saw that. All the big companies pouring money onto actual trained Marxists. George Soros. Right? Here's one of the other co-founders. Opal Tometi, there was three of them. Her parents immigrated to the United States from Nigeria, and they repaid our kindness as Americans, letting them into the country by having her wage war on our country. Here she is in Venezuela, standing next to the mass murdering dictator, Nicolas Maduro. She put this on Twitter, holding the communist clenched fist. She said, oh, it's so nice to be in a country where we have intelligent political discourse, like the kind where we torture our opponents and throw them in jail. Okay? Now, the last of the trifecta, the three co-founders of Black Lives Matter, you heard her mention Alicia Garza, right? Myself and Alicia, we're trained Marxists. Here's Alicia.
Yeah. What do you think's at stake in November election?
Everything. Like everything is at stake, and I'm really not being facetious about that. to be real, what's at stake is whether or not a new world order is able to take root and grow.
All right. So the trained Marxists want a new world order too, right? Just like Bush, just like Clinton, just like all of them. Now, all this manufacturing of enemies, right? The Nazis, Chinese communists, Soviets, invisible enemies, jihadists, Vietnamese communists, Cuban communists, right? All these manufactured enemies. Is this deliberate or is it an accident? I mean, there's only two choices. Either they're doing it on purpose or they're just total idiots. I mean, those are really the options that we're left with. Now, the great Secretary of Defense, actually the first ever Secretary of Defense, was quoted in a book by a U.S. Senator saying something really profound. He said, "Consistency has never been a mark of stupidity. If the diplomats who have mishandled our relations with Russia were merely stupid, they would occasionally make a mistake in our favor." And that applies to all of Washington, D.C. If these people were just idiots, and it's very fashionable to say, oh, Biden's such an idiot, or the people running America are such idiots. It would be nice if they were idiots, because occasionally they'd make a mistake in our favor, and yet they never do. Right? Everything they do seems to hurt our country more and more. So what do we do? And we'll talk more about this. But turn off the TV, get good sources of information, get your kids out of government brainwash camps. We need to enforce the Constitution. We need to get involved in the political process. We need voter integrity. We need honest money. Get involved with the John Birch Society. We need to appeal to heaven, as our forefathers did. We need to understand that ultimately this is a spiritual battle, not a political, educational, economic battle, or even a cultural battle. It's a spiritual battle. As Ephesians 6:12 explains, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. It's not Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Dick Cheney, whatever. Those aren't really the problem. Right? Satan is using minions to accomplish his purposes. He says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and against spiritual wickedness in high places. And bad news for them, right? You got the 3,000 years ago, David explained that the kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire together against the Lord and his anointed one. Some translations say that they take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed one. And you can imagine God was probably just terrified. Oh no! What shall we do, right? So the one enthroned in heaven laughs, the Lord ridicules them. And then if you go to verse 5, it says, he will speak to them in his wrath. You don't want to be on the wrong side of that.